got it. We had a very good morning session, which has been recorded as well. So those who were not able to join us or live in the other side of the Atlantic and could not get up so early, which is understandable, you might check it later on our website. We will inform you about it. And this one will be recorded certainly as well. I just make a couple of words before we start, mentioning that the morning session was mostly about the European Union, the future of Europe and the debate, the conference on the future of Europe, but behind it, beyond it, also the geopolitical consequences of the recent events, and certainly the brutal war initiated by the Russian president would influence our afternoon session very much. When we started to think about this event, we had no idea how important and accurate this debate, this talk will be, what we will have now in the afternoon. It has changed already all the discussions about all the issues what we will cover today, including populism, illiberalism, geopolitics, security, media, all sorts of issues we were interested in a couple of months ago when we started this initiative. But still, the topic is more or less the same. I'm sure all of you will talk a little bit about Ukraine and the heroism of the resistance of the Ukrainian people and the need for solidarity and what to do and how to do it. But on the other hand, we have to insist a little bit on our previous agenda. But feel free, I'm talking to now to our speakers, feel free to mix it up, to combine both approaches, the current situation and the more general topics. So today in the first session, we will focus on the future of liberal democracies. From my perspective, what might be characterized with a question mark, a new era for the global cooperation of democracies. And this is certainly a question raised because of the flagship project of the Biden administration, this Summit for Democracy, what was initiated by then candidate President Joe Biden 2 years ago now, actually, and which already, this Democracy Summit had already an online meeting last December, and we'll have another one, maybe hopefully in person at the end of this year. So that's the starting point, but we will have others who are going to speak from different aspects about the same issues, focusing on security in a broader sense and liberal order, whether it will survive these terrible days or what will come next. I will not introduce all the speakers at the beginning because I don't want to take more time, but just mentioning that the first speaker, and thank you for accepting our invitation, Jonathan, will be Jonathan Katz, a senior fellow and director of democracy initiatives at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, a former deputy assistant administration at the US Agency for International Development in Washington, DC. So Jonathan, the floor is yours. What we discuss, what you are going to speak about is more or less the number one issue for us in the afternoon. What are the objectives of Biden's initiative? What has happened until now? What are the successes and failures of this initiative? And what should be, from a realistic point of view, the outcome of this big exercise? So the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us, Jonathan.
Thank you, and it's good to see you. Good morning from Washington, D.C., and a good afternoon to everybody else joining on the other side of the pond. And it's what you've given me a very easy topic to lay out. Not really, but obviously really of critical importance. And I did want to start off by just thanking you, and then also your colleagues for the invitation to join today, and those that are also on the screen who will be speaking as well. You have some great experts with many years of experience, including with respect to dealing with the current challenges in Ukraine, the current military campaign. And I just wanted to say, I think I wanted to start off by saying that I thought that President Zelensky's speech yesterday at the U.S. Congress was incredibly powerful. It speaks directly to the issues that you're talking about today, about the issues of democracy, sovereignty, territorial integrity, the pillars of the Summit for Democracy, which you laid out. President Biden and then candidate Biden in 2020 announced that he would host really the first ever Summit for Democracy that ended up taking place within the first year of his administration. But President Zelensky's speech yesterday and his call for support is very much connected to President Biden's democracy agenda. And when Biden started his administration and laid out his first interim national security strategy in March 2021, if you just look through that strategy, throughout it, democracy was highlighted as the top objective, the need to reorient not only the United States, but with transatlantic partners and globally, the fight for democracy. And so I wanted to just start there because I think it's particularly important to bring the U.S. perspective to what's taking place, not only in Ukraine, but the fight for democracy in the Biden administration. And so I think as we look back, the Biden administration came in on the heels of the Trump administration. And this is still very much relevant for the conversation we're having about democracy, both in the United States and globally. The events of January 6th had a dramatic impact, not only globally, but clearly on President Biden and the American public and how it views democracy and the threats to democracy. And so when you listen very carefully to President Biden when he speaks, he talks about January 6th, and he talks about the need to address what he has seen as a shifting geopolitical landscape over the last decade. I think even when he was vice president of the United States, and needing to revamp a global strategy to revitalize democracy. The Summit for Democracy is one vehicle as part of the democracy agenda for the Biden administration. It is not the end all be all, but a critical vehicle to achieve that objectives. Now, within the context of that democracy agenda, the president and his administration outlined three main areas, three main buckets of work that they were focused on, that they felt were critical to addressing democratic backsliding, both in the United States and globally as well. And what they looked at was countering authoritarians, defending against, which I think is very much relevant to the current conversation we're having with about Mr. Putin, or the over-the-horizon challenge, or today challenge of China and other autocrats. The other basket was was combating corruption. And combating corruption, as you can see, is something that is very much front and center, even when we talk about the current challenges with Mr. Putin. And so the Biden administration over the past year, they kicked off a whole new whole of government approach to countering authoritarianism. Even over the last 2 weeks with relations to Russia, the Department of Justice and Treasury Department have launched, I think, some of the most substantial anti-corruption campaigns targeting those figures who have been sanctioned by the United States, Europe, and other partners globally. The third basket is human rights and defending human rights. And this is clearly in scope today when we see what's taking place in Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities today, how important it is to advance human rights in that context. And you are right, we saw the summit take place. There was over 100 participants participating countries that joined, that made significant commitments to advance these three areas. We have something called the Year of Action, which the Biden administration launched after the Summit for Democracy, which is supposed to be this period where all of the countries, this is the important role that civil society plays, and governments too, in meeting the commitments made by governments who made these pledges back in December. And so we're in this year of action right now, and leading up to the second summit. And István, I think that it's more likely that we will see a summit in 2023, maybe at the beginning. But my hope is, based on the current situation, the current need to address the challenges of authoritarians, the collective response that we have seen from transatlantic allies and partners in some ways has actually sped up the efforts to address all of these challenges. And so despite the ongoing conflict, the horrors that we're seeing in terms of war, the transatlantic community is as close as it's been in many years. This is an opportunity to accelerate the actions that have been taken. And what I see is that this is a moment to leapfrog and push the democracy agenda forward in a much more significant way than we have seen. And so in many ways, the current war can be a catalyst in an unfortunate situation to address these three buckets of issues that the Summit for Democracy laid out. And I would argue too, in seeing the actions, the swift action being taken, I think the most significant economic measures taken to hold a government accountable, like Russia and Mr. Putin accountable and those around him, that we should be taking advantage of this moment to not only advance sanctions for sanctions' sake, but doing it because it's a fight against corruption. It's a fight for human rights. And when we think about the measures that are being in place, this can truly be a catalyst in the lead up to the next summit, a real transformative moment. But it also will require, as we continue to see, a challenge in how governments and private sector and other key actors want to play with authoritarian governments. What type of economic relationship do we want to have with Russia, China? What kind of future do we want to look at when we look at oil and gas? And right now, we still see in Europe, and particularly even in Germany, the continued buying of gas from Russia to meet energy needs. And so I think we're in a particularly important moment. I don't think when President Biden gave his Munich speech, almost a year ago, and then laid out this democracy agenda, that he knew definitely that we would be so confronted so quickly with this type of war in Ukraine, or the coalescing around the transatlantic community and transatlantic values. And I would just argue, I think we're in a very different space than we were even when the summit took place in December. Clearly, we see actions being taken that really fast forward, accelerate the democracy agenda. And the question I think we all have to ask is, how do we build on that momentum right now? And if we talk about decoupling from Russia, which is a difficult question economically and politically, what does that look like? And how do we want to address corruption in a way that's cohesive? Because what we're likely to see in the case of sanctions is that there will be a number of countries, potentially like China or India, could be Turkey, that will be potential go-arounds on sanctions. I think we're at that moment right now to set these norms and these standards together in the transatlantic community. The Summit for Democracy is a vehicle to advance some of these goals. Governments are committing increased funding, not only to support democracy globally, civil society, independent media, but we're also looking at governments strengthening their internal mechanisms, whether we're talking about rule of law, whether we're talking about how to engage with the right actors globally, creating the right mechanisms to hold corrupt actors, not only government officials like Mr. Putin, but the enablers, and going after them. And so there's really been tremendous progress. I don't think that it was expected to move in this way. And I know when we looked at the summit, there was a push from some governments, but I think this moment really requires us to think about how we permanently change this effort in a way that has longer lasting effect, if we're going to truly defend against authoritarians, if we're going to truly go after corrupt actors, if we're truly going to enforce human rights, those all need to be revamped, take advantage of the current moment right now, and then also find a way over the next year in the lead up to the next summit to really cement the gains and really move forward in a way that I think President Biden and then candidate Biden thought about a year plus ago, and how do we really do that and take this forward in a much more significant way. So thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan, for this introduction. I think we cannot underestimate the importance of this Biden's exercise and experiment in a way how to bring together actors for democracy globally. But so my question is exactly about this, that I've read some criticism that certainly the argument says it's impossible to have a common platform with so different states and politicians, also ideologically and geographically, with very different perspectives and often very different interests. So how would you evaluate what happened until now? Was the Biden administration or the State Department able to make a joint agenda, what should be achieved by the end of this exercise? You say it's probably the beginning of next year, not the end of this one, but we will see. And certainly things have changed, as we both talked about it. So what do you think, what can be achieved? Is it realistic to think that India, Poland, the United States can cooperate globally? And maybe I have a second question, being a Hungarian. Hungary was not invited to this summit, and I think when many of us understand why. But there were some others who were invited, maybe with a similar record. So how would you react to that question as well? The floor is yours.
Yeah, I think the Biden administration did a very good job. You know, that was a major issue. Is how do you, how when you're looking across the board, who's included, who's not. Hungary was not, but the door was open to Hungarian civil society and other voices as well. And I think that's important that it's inclusive beyond just government officials. And I thought, having 100+ countries participating, each making pledges is really important. And I think you will not have anybody who's done this type of summit work knows that it's not going to be 100% perfect, but the baskets of work that the administration is focused on and seeing the reaction and then the government commitments to carry out the action says to me that there's a tremendous amount of interest in this agenda. And I only think that the last couple of weeks, the last 3 weeks, is going to accelerate why we need and why governments, while civil society, independent media, and other actors, private sector as well, when you see private sector leaving in droves from Russia right now. Now, some of that's out of pressure, out of reputational pressure, but also there are those that are using this as a statement as well. So I think that this is a moment, and I think that the administration, the commitments that they received, suggests to me that there's a lot more interest in sort of moving forward and doing it collaboratively with the United States. And I'll give the administration a lot of credit. The Biden administration has spent a lot of time working on these areas of collaboration, including in the lead up to, unfortunately, this war, and sort of laying out things that needed to be done. And I think this sets an important framework for that cooperation. It's not only the United States and Europe that are engaged in sanctioning Russia and Russian entities or individuals. There's South Korea, Taiwan. We have other Asian partners in Asia as well. So I think that there's a significant group ready to carry out this work. And because the Biden administration is moving forward, and I do think the U.S. is is very much in the lead on this, particularly as it relates to countering corruption. I think they're laying out the framework for governments to copy, whether we talk about Global Magnitsky Act to deal with both humanitarian issues, but also when we look at anti-corruption measures. I know that I'm part of a number of groups that are that are transatlantic, that are focused on these sanctions, on sort of taking the next step. So I do hear, and I know that there's some criticism, in terms of maybe some of those that were invited. India is particularly important. Some have said, well, maybe they shouldn't have been invited, or other specific countries. But I actually think the Biden administration did an excellent job at making certain that you had geographic representation, and that you also had many of the emerging democracies, or maybe transitional democracies, as some call them, also participating. And that's important. But countries that are led by autocracies, China was not there, Russia was not there, Turkey was not there, and obviously, and then also Hungary as well. And so I think you can say that I think it's just as important to send a counter message as well, that the behavior of autocracies, which have a direct impact, as we see, on security, economics, future climate change, we're at that moment of sort of between these two in autocracy and democracies. And I think that the line was very much drawn as part of this summit. And I think you'll see that again, and I think it will only be amplified based on what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, well, it's more or less clear. Yes, you have to make a decision at one point, and also the agenda is maybe even more important, what to focus on. And regarding the agenda, my second question would be about the outcome. So what would you expect at the end? A sort of document, or a new institution, or just a big gathering to demonstrate a joint will? So I think for most of us, it's not really evident what should be the legacy of that big exercise in a year or so, when it's completed. We have about 8-10 minutes. So if you, Jonathan, can answer quickly, then we might have some more time for questions from the audience, because I know that Jamie Shea has to leave around 3 o'clock, so we shouldn't be too long with the first speaker. The floor is yours.
Sure. You need to get to Jamie. That's gonna, he's the showstopper here. But I think what you hope out of the legacy of this, one is there's a discussion about having this be an annual event, and I'm a strong supporter of having sort of an annual focus on the Summit for Democracy, not just the United States hosting, but others hosting this beyond as a legacy, and to ensure that there is follow-up from each summit. As I mentioned, the Biden administration not only mentioned the Summit for Democracy, the first round, but also a year of action, which we're in the middle of right now, and then also the second Summit for Democracy in person in Washington. So when I look at what we're trying to, and what I think the administration is trying to get out of this, is the government commitments from other countries being fulfilled. I don't see the United States holding governments accountable for their commitments. I think the expectation is that within each country, that civil societies within countries, and there are a number of organizations that are actually amalgamating these commitments, and then also, making certain that between now and the second summit, that governments are held accountable for those commitments. And I think that's particularly important. You asked about legacy. I mean, Biden administration has already committed over $400 million in new funding for democracy support, supporting independent media, supporting, fighting corruption, bolstering democratic reformers, advancing technology for democracy, defending free and fair elections and political processes. So they laid out their cards in terms of additional funding. Several other governments also committed to similar types of funding. That is particularly important. Several governments committed to addressing anti-corruption laws within their own countries, to prevent governments from parking, like Mr. Putin, or enablers preventing them from parking their money in, whether it's London or in South Dakota, or anywhere else in the world, to address issues of corruption. And so I think that you'll measure it by a couple of things. One is taking what those commitments that were made, seeing if governments are actually fulfilling those commitments, pushing hard for that in cooperation with each other, and then having governments also make a second round of commitments beyond the first at the second summit. So I think there's an expectation that governments will come back to the table again, walking through their explanation, through their interventions, what they've done and what they will do. And the legacy of this, I think, from the right now will be, governments coming through with real concrete commitments, the support of civil society, independent media, and support from the private sector, who's critical to making certain that these commitments, their end of the bargain, is also met when it comes to support for democracy. And I think we're seeing examples of that right now with the private sector and industry leaving Russia.
Yeah, I think that this part of the project is very important, that in many countries, including Hungary, the attacks against independent NGOs or the free media, you mentioned both, was so striking and dominant, and has changed the political domestic landscape so much that many NGOs in Hungary are seen by the government as foreign agents and representatives of non-Hungarian interests and values, that somehow to fight against this sort of ideology, populism and illiberalism, I think it's an important part of that project. And if this mission will be part of the legacy and will be represented at the second meeting, that would be a very important signal for many of us living in so-called hybrid regimes, not full-scale authoritarian regimes, but not in liberal democracies anymore. I would like to ask anybody has a question, because we still have 2 or 3 more minutes before we pass the floor to our second speaker. Zsuzsa, please be short, because Jamie has to leave at 3 o'clock, and put your question, and then Jonathan, please answer it directly. Zsuzsa.
Hello, everyone. And hello, Jonathan. I just want to learn from you regarding the Summit of Democracies. Is there any special role in Europe in this process, more than only its member states? Is there EU playing any specific role? Do you see, is it going somewhere? The US administration regards it as a kind of specific partner. So what do you think of this? Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. And of course, there was the EU is limited because of Hungary's not being invited, but also playing a role in negating the high level visibility, based on sort of EU, the EU itself, and rules internally in member states. So that was a problem, but also I thought it highlights exactly the problem, what's taking place in Hungary, and the need to address, what was just said about the hybrid regime that's in place in the upcoming elections, which are very much in focus here in Washington, and concerns about a free and fair election and transparent election, certainly on the agenda. But on the EU, and I'll just be very quick, there is, I think, an incredibly important role for the EU to play. My expectation is at the US-EU summit, will likely be in July under the Czech presidency, that the democracy agenda will be a significant part of that conversation. But already the interaction between the Biden administration and Brussels has been very significant, a sea change from where it was in the Trump administration. And you see the close cooperation right now on sanctions and anti-corruption measures, tech councils, things that will need to be addressed as they deal with defending against authoritarians, But when we talk about both Russia and China, it's a challenging issue for EU member states and the United States. And I expect that conversation will accelerate in the sense of how both sides are going to be addressing engagement with authoritarians. That includes both Russia and China, but I think China is the more difficult issue, because what we're likely to see around the bend is China evading, or maybe sanctions supporting Russia, and the potential for this of China to be really the next more challenging issue for both sides to deal with. And it's directly connected to the Summit for Democracy, because all the buckets, defending against authoritarians, fighting corruption, human rights, these are all issues and challenges with China as well. So my expectation is this will be high on the agenda. There is closer collaboration that I've seen in many years between the United States and the EU. And so I see a direct role. Some of the member states of the EU, though, I think can be a detractor and also pull the EU away from doing this work. But I think Hungary is very much a minority in this. And my hope is that that won't impact the ongoing cooperation. I'm over my time. I know I'm looking at the time, and you got to get to Jamie, but it's been great. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. And sorry, no, I did not want to urge you at all. Just we have to keep on time. And thank you for mentioning well, both China and Hungary, which shows that big power like China certainly influences the agenda, but a relatively small country like Hungary might also play, in this case, a negative but important role, forming a democratic or illiberal global order. So it's for us in Hungary especially exciting that you in the United States and in many other countries follow so closely what's going on in our country. We will discuss it later. Jonathan, please stay with us. Maybe there will be some more questions at the end of this session to you as well, if you are able to stay with us for longer. Thank you. And now I really would like to give the floor to Jamie Shea, whom I met many years ago in Brussels when he worked for NATO, in the NATO headquarters. I think it was the old headquarters in Brussels before NATO moved to another place. But Jamie is now especially a senior advisor at the European Policy Center also in Brussels. And in his role, he is very often a speaker at different conferences. Well, you were well known also in Hungary during the Yugoslav war, when you were a sort of communicator for NATO action in the region. So I think many of us you know you very well, and I ask you to speak about security and geopolitical considerations for our decade in a very broader sense, which when you might include Russia, China, and transatlantic relations. But again, Vladimir Putin a little bit changed the framework of our conference. So if you want to focus more on Ukraine, it's certainly acceptable. If you want to talk in a broader sense about geopolitics and security, please go ahead. The floor is yours for about 15 minutes. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Well, it is, and thanks very much for the kind introduction. Good to see you again, if only virtually today, but you're still virtually, István. You look just as good, or almost just as good, as you do in real life, so that's encouraging. I think Jonathan has already switched off, but I would have thanked him also for his nice remarks, but also for broaching many of the themes. I was sort of ticking a box of common sort of themes as he spoke. The themes that I also want to address today. But before I start, I also need to salute my old colleague, former ambassador of Latvia to NATO, former minister, of course, distinguished minister of the Latvian government, Imants Lieģis. Good to see you too, Imants, looking, as we said earlier, alive and kicking. even better, fit and healthy. Well, I think the first thing to say about the new environment is obviously we are going from a world where we hope for great power cooperation, then for great power competition, but at least peaceful competition, to unfortunately the worst of the three options, which is great power confrontation. After the Cold War, the great hope was that the world would still obviously be a turbulent place. There would be no end of history. That was always a silly idea. There would be all kinds of crises, all kinds of minor conflicts, all kinds of disputes, but that on most of the big issues, the major powers of the world, Russia, the United States, the EU, China, would come together, recognizing sort of common interest in maintaining globalization in the open trading system. Both Russia and China, since the end of the Cold War, have benefited enormously from that, as Russia, of course, is now discovering as those benefits are taken away with the sanctions. There was a sense that climate change, where, of course, both Russia and China are very much on the receiving end of some of the worst impacts. Think of those forest fires in Siberia over the last 2 summers, that would also be a unifying factor. And indeed, as recently as the Glasgow COP26 last October, the Chinese were still sort of being moderately cooperative. At least they sent a delegation and negotiated. We seemed for a while to be able to cooperate on issues like piracy. We seemed to be able to cooperate on the Iranian nuclear file, the common interest of nuclear powers in keeping the nuclear club as small as possible. Of course, it was always on a bit of a slide downhill, István, as you well know, since the heyday of the first Gulf War of 1991. When we had the unity in the UN Security Council to empower the international coalition led by the United States to evict Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. But you know, as late as 2011, Russia was still cooperating with NATO and the West over Libya. And in January, you know, just 6 weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, of course, including Russia and China, still prepared and agreed a joint statement ahead of what they thought was going to be the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, now postponed because of COVID. But they produced a joint statement calling for more nuclear arms control and to prevent nuclear proliferation. So we felt that, you know, we would continue in the 21st century largely with this mix of, on the one hand, competition, yes, a certain degree of containment or constrainment is the word the Americans used as a new form of containment, pushback where clearly great powers were encroaching upon our values or our interests, but also a large degree of cooperation, and that, you know, balancing across those 3 pillars would be what diplomats would be paid to do the best they possibly could. But I think now, unfortunately, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the way in which China up to now seems to be supporting Russia, at least diplomatically and in propaganda terms, we'll have to wait and see if that Chinese support also translates into financial and military support as well. But we are clearly now in a world where that hope for a kind of entente cordiale on big issues of the great powers is broken down. And this is beginning to look like Cold War II. And already strategists in the United States are speaking about going back to containment. George Kennan's famous long telegram of 1946 is being dusted down and reread and reabsorbed. And we now are in a world where clearly the democracies are going to be on the defensive and have to defend themselves, and not, unfortunately, at that world where we hope to be after 1990, where democracy would be the natural order of things. We wouldn't really have to do very much to make it happen, precisely because it was the natural order of things, and we could look forward to a world of more democracies. Jonathan, of course, in promoting the Alliance of Democracies, is mindful of the fact that every year Freedom House shows that more countries are backsliding away from democracies and democratic standards. I think last year was the year since the end of the Cold War when we had more authoritarian regimes in the world than we had democracies. The authoritarians are encouraged because they believe that history is on their side. So we're going to go through a turbulent couple of decades ahead. There's no doubt about that. What do we have to do? Well, obviously, number one, and you would not be surprised to hear me saying this, is defense is going to have to be a much higher priority for all of our democracies. Armed defense, the ability to fight, the ability to beat great power competitors on the battlefield if we have to. Deterrence is going to have to mean defense and not simply a political symbol of political resolve. What is happening now with NATO, and you've seen this, all of you, with the NATO defense ministers meeting yesterday, is that clearly NATO can no longer afford to simply have 4 multinational battalions in the Baltic states and in Poland. Those battalions are going to have to become brigades or divisions. They're going to have to be armored. They're going to have to be permanent. They're going to have to be supplied with in-place stockpiling of military equipment. They are going to also have to be extended down to the Black Sea region. I salute NATO's decision to create 4 new multinational battalions in Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, perhaps also, and Bulgaria. And indeed, the decision of countries like Slovakia and Hungary to allow more NATO troops on their territory for this purpose. Because clearly, we can no longer take it for granted that Putin will not challenge NATO. It may be deliberate, it may be accidental as a result of the spillover of the conflict in Ukraine. Everybody, of course, was mindful of that when we saw the Russian cruise missiles land at the Yavoriv air base in Ukraine, just 20 kilometers from the Polish border last Sunday. But I think, without wishing to depress anybody, but I think realistically that at the end of the Ukrainian conflict, whatever outcome it has, we're likely to see Russian troops permanently in Belarus, probably more Russian forces permanently stationed in Ukraine in large numbers, closer to our borders, decreasing NATO's warning time. So what we now see, of course, in NATO is a magnificent initial response. 10 allies have sent forces to the eastern borders of NATO. The United States has sent as many as all of the other NATO members combined, which, after all of the doubts of the Trump years about the solidity of Article 5, is a very obviously encouraging signal. But of course, most of those forces have been sent on an ad hoc, temporary basis, with no intention to keep them there permanently. So what we now need from NATO is a coherent sort of battle plan of what kind of posture is going to be needed, and more central control from NATO of where those forces should be stationed. It's no good, if you like, the United States saying, oh, we're going to put an extra 1,000 in Poland, if the Supreme Allied Commander Europe says, no, thank you very much, but from my responsibility to defend Europe, it's going to be more important to put those 1,000 in Bulgaria or Romania or Hungary or wherever or somewhere else. Secondly, we're obviously going to have to devote more of our resources to defense. Already Germany, rather spectacularly, if you think of the last few years, has endorsed the 2%. At least in terms of being willing to meet it, has endorsed the 2% target, has agreed to spend 100 billion extra euros on the much needed modernization of the Bundeswehr. Poland has announced 2%. Countries in the Baltic states, Imants, I'm not sure about Latvia, but I think I saw Lithuania announced 2.5%. But we're going to need to spend more on the modernization and the maintenance, the high readiness of our armed forces. And politicians are going to have to get out there and make the case of why this is going to be needed. But as we spend more money, it's very easy, István, as you know, to waste money on defense. Germany has a nightmare history with procurement, but it's not unique in NATO. And we're going to have to be very clear in the alliance how we spend this money wisely to get the maximum value in terms of military technology, preparedness and capability out of that. And I think that's going to be a challenge, because otherwise we'll spend a lot of money, but without getting that extra deterrence that we hope for. There's going to have to be a balance here between between what the United States can do in the long run, given the commitments of the United States to the Indo-Pacific region, which are not going to go away because of Russia, and what the Europeans are prepared to take on. For example, if Germany is spending all of this money, will Germany recreate armored divisions to place in Eastern Europe? Is this the moment, if Germany again is going to become the dominant military power on the continent, which was the case of Germany after 1871, should this be the moment, as Radek Sikorski, the former Polish foreign minister, has advocated, to Europeanize the new formations that Germany will be creating? The other issue is European strategic autonomy. Does this now have to be rethought as an EU contribution towards NATO's collective defense in terms of steering things like PESCO and the European Defense Fund, for the people who know about all of this technical stuff, to steer those more towards NATO requirements and less towards the old idea of European strategic autonomy, which that it was to do things largely in Africa or in the Middle East or in places where NATO was unlikely to deploy. We're also going to have to achieve a balance, István, between collective defense requirements and the need to still maintain an expeditionary force. Because again, although we're focusing on Ukraine at the moment, the problems of jihadism in the Sahel on the increase. 80% of all terrorist attacks in the world today are now in sub-Saharan Africa. Those problems are not going to go away. The competition that we have got with Russia and China in the Middle East, in Africa, is not going to go away. The need for humanitarian operations, they're not going to go away. So just like, you know, we may have rather falsely believed back in the 90s that we could sacrifice collective defense for expeditionary capability, it's all about Afghanistan, right? Now we mustn't make the alternative mistake of thinking it's all about collective defense and we no longer require expeditionary capability as well. Second thing we've got to look at briefly is vulnerable states. Unfortunately, with Ukraine, it's a little bit late, but we still have to think very hard-headed, István, about what Ukraine is going to look like. Where's it going to be geographically at the end? I mean, free and independent Ukraine at the end of this particular crisis. What can be saved from the terrible wreckage that Putin is inflicting on this country? What do we do about other states that are clearly vulnerable? Moldova, 15% of the population now consisting of refugees. Clearly Poland and other states, albeit NATO members, but which are in a fragile, delicate situation. What do we do about Georgia, which also, of course, has the perspective of NATO membership and has not, unlike President Zelensky, renounced it, at least for the time being. And of course, this also reflects on the situation of Taiwan. What are the lessons of the support that we're currently giving to Ukraine to fight back that we also need to apply to those other fragile states to make them more resilient in the face of other possible attacks? I think, István, the third issue is resilience of our own societies. We've had a whole series of shocks to the system. Some have come from non-man-made factors. You know, you think of climate change. You know, climate change, of course, has a man-made origin in terms of the consumption of fossil fuels. But, you know, if one thinks of natural disasters, one thinks of COVID and so on, we've had to learn to become more resilient in terms of supply chains, in terms of solidarity, even the use of our armed forces to distribute vaccines or to build hospitals or to guard buildings against terrorist attacks. We've had to learn also to cope with issues like cyber attacks and hybrid warfare scenarios. We've learned a lot about the corruption that Jonathan was speaking of. I, of course, today live in London grad, although hopefully it won't deserve that title for much longer. The UK government is finally acting against that. Corrupt influence networks, interference actions, aggressive intelligence operations, and so on. How can we bring all of those various strands, which have a common denominator called resilience, situational awareness, resilience, solidarity, making yourself less vulnerable to those kind of manipulations? How can we bring all of that experience together in NATO to build a more resilient world against the shocks that are going to come our way? Because a lot of it is common, you know, the same kind of responses that you need in terms of whole of government approaches, mobilization of your civil society, mobilization of private sector, the unbelievable mobilization of our science and technology base to get a vaccine against COVID in less than 9 months. Absolutely incredible what the West can do when it really sort of puts its mind to doing something. How can we take that approach towards an overall concept of societal resilience? Two final things before I close. Geopolitics. We're back in the world of geopolitics, and that's going to imply some pretty difficult choices. Of course, on the one hand, this is a great wake-up call to all of us to move in a direction which will make us more resilient in the future. For example, greening our economies so that we no longer need fossil fuels, which unfortunately tend to be supplied by authoritarian and unreliable regimes for the most part, but not exclusively. For example, if American shale gas is ramped up to full production, it can easily replace all of the gas that we currently import from Russia. But of course, that is, you know, getting off nuclear power, getting off fossil fuels is going to take a time. So unfortunately, there are going to be some difficult geopolitical decisions in the short term. For example, my leader, because I'm in the UK, Boris Johnson, he's in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates at the moment, trying to persuade the Saudis and the Emiratis to persuade OPEC to turn on the oil taps, because that, of course, will get the price of fuel down at the petrol pump for our hard-pressed consumers. I can understand this, because the last thing we want, István, is for the great resistance to Russia to collapse, because suddenly people think, I want to stand up to Russia, but not if it means that my energy bill doubles, as mine has in Brussels, by the way, over the last couple of weeks. So governments are going to have a difficult task of balancing, you know, being firm on the geopolitical front with convincing their public opinion to accept the need for sacrifice at home. But we've got to keep that sacrifice as small as we possibly can. Otherwise, the social consensus will start to fragment over time. So geopolitics may be accepting the lesser evil in order to confront the greater evil on a temporary basis. There are going to be some difficult choices that we're going to have to make here, and we're going to have to be frank with our publics as to why we are making them. I could speak at length about, of course, also how we deal with our authoritarian competitors in the long run. Maybe when historians write the history of this crisis, the most interesting point will not be Russia or Putin, but will be China. And has China sort of seized on this crisis to firmly sort of ally itself with Russia in the new axis of the authoritarians, so that they become, if you like, an inseparable duo? They're certainly not there yet. Or will this be the crisis with some very clever Western diplomacy that convinces Beijing that it is not going on a wise path if it follows Putin into reckless adventurism? The sanctions against its own economy could do it even more damage than the sanctions being inflicted on Russia. It certainly will give up its aspiration to be a responsible international actor. So this could be the moment when China realizes that the Russian route really serves Putin's interests, but certainly not Beijing's interests. That, I think, is going to be one of the biggest challenges to look at. Finally, I just wanted to finish where Jonathan finished, which is to say that, you know, always good things come out of even the most terrible things. We've seen a rallying of the West. Jonathan mentioned this. I want to endorse it. But Biden is coming back to Europe. The United States officials have been in Europe more than they've been in Washington over the last couple of months. Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has seen European leaders more frequently than he's seen his wife and children. It's been remarkable the way in which the transatlantic community has pulled back together. It's on the basis of what István was being talked about at the end of the Q&A session, the way in which the EU and the US and our, you know, the Trade and Technology Council, the security dialogue, the China dialogue, the way they're now pulling together behind a common strategy, the way in which the West has reached out to Australia, Japan, I mean, even Switzerland. Would you, István, have put any money on this a month ago? No. Even Switzerland, famous for its neutrality, yesterday announced another raft of sanctions to align itself with the EU. We've seen this extraordinary mobilization of civil society to help the refugees in the private sector. This was mentioned in the past, but the West has been more visible as a genuine entity over the last couple of weeks than we've seen for many long years. How can we now translate this spirit into the rebuilding, if you like, the rebooting of NATO, of the World Trade Organization, the G7, of these institutions to build a solid democratic structure for the difficult times ahead? We don't want it simply to be, if you like, a wonderfully sunny summer, but which disappears as soon as the autumn rains come back. And of course, as leaders don't stay forever, that is going to be, I think, a big challenge over the next couple of months. Thank you. Spoken at far too great length, but that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jamie. And it's an extraordinary picture with a lot of details. I only would like to pick one, and I know you have to leave soon, so I think we should focus on one aspect or one guy called Vladimir Putin. And here I would like to be a little bit the devil's advocate. A lot of experts said many years ago that we are facing a sort of second Cold War or Cold War 2.0. I don't know whether you would describe this new situation as a new Cold War, but my question is, during the Cold War, and especially during the last 10, 20 decades, 10, 20 years, 2 decades of the Cold War, engagement and deterrence have been combined, especially during détente. So my devil's advocate question is, what if Ukraine makes a deal with Russia in the following days or weeks, sort of peace after sort of so-called peace negotiations, and Ukraine accepts whatever peace it will be? What should the West, in a broader sense, the West do in that case? Only the scenario what you suggest, or to combine it with some sort of engagement for the future? So what would be your reaction to that question? Please unmute yourself. I cannot hear you.
Oh, I apologize. Yes, it's a good question, a tough question, because of course there are so many different scenarios. Russia wins, Ukraine manages to force the Russians out. Those are probably the extreme scenarios at both ends, and we're likely to have something messier in the middle. I unfortunately am sort of predict a kind of Donetsk big scenario where Russia will eventually stop fighting because of the risks to it are so high, but will end up in possession of a large chunk of Ukrainian territory. The problem with Russian troops is when they arrive, they never leave. As we've seen in Georgia, Moldova, as we've seen in Ukraine, in Crimea, and of course in Donetsk. And of course, Belarus is going to find this out now too. So my fear is that where we're going to end up is that Russia will sort of stop fighting, agree to a ceasefire, and just like we had that sort of line of in Donetsk with Luhansk in the Donbass, we're now going to have that, along the Black Sea, around Kharkiv and so on, so that Ukraine will keep the great chunk of its territory, and hopefully President Zelensky and the government, of course, a democratic government, will survive, but it will be an armed peace. It won't be a real peace, and we'll go back to that, hot war to a lesser war of, 14,000 people dead from the Donbass conflict alone after 2014, shelling across the border and so on. And therefore, the key issue, I think, for the Western governments will be, first of all, of course, non-recognition, obviously, of these unilateral Russian territorial acquisitions, and what we do to buttress Ukraine in such a way that we don't have what we always have with Putin, which is a small occupation, a 5-year hiatus, and then another offensive to gain more territory. I think when you come to the Cold War, we could talk about this for many hours, but yes, there are going to be some features which are common to the Cold War. We are going to need a very clear red line when it comes to deterrence, as we had during the Cold War. We're going to have to compete with Russia for influence in Africa and the Middle East and in Asia, like we had during the Cold War. We're going to have to use sanctions policy, as we had during the Cold War, to deprive the Russian military of technologies that they can use, obviously, to modernize. And that's already being spoken about as well. Maybe over time, we will go back to the arms control type of agenda that we had before. But there's a very big difference this time. The Soviet Union was in a much stronger position than Russia. It had an ideology which at least appealed to millions of people for a while, right? Ideological allies. It had support of communist parties within Western Europe that would lobby for its on its behalf. The faith in democracy in those days was far less than it is today, and therefore, to my mind, there will be some sort of common elements. But the West is far stronger now, provided it sticks together and continues to impose the sanctions than it was during the Cold War. So we're much more on the winning side now than it would have looked to people in the 1940s or the 1950s.
Well, that's a very optimistic and positive ending of your contribution, Jamie. Thank you very much. I think we learned a lot, and I am especially pleasant hearing you bringing all these issues together and making it evident that so many things are interconnected nowadays. And in spite of many counter arguments, we live in a global situation when what happens in Hungary and in China that has an influence on the other side of the Atlantic or even the Pacific. So that's very important. But coming back to our neighbor Ukraine, I think that that's very important, and we will go on to discuss it in a minute. It's very important that in the longer run, or in the middle run at least, we might be more optimistic than we used to be 40 years ago. And then it turned out to be a regime change and the collapse of communism in many countries. And I hope that you are right, that at least we live in a intermediate situation when Russia seems to be stronger as it is in reality, and we will be able to face this challenge all together. And the West is stronger than it looked to be a couple of years ago. And it's very important for us because the topic of our conference is the future of liberal democracy. So how we get out from this crisis and many other crises, that's important for Hungary and for the world in general. So thank you, Jamie, for joining us, and see you soon at another event. Thank you and bye-bye. Now we go on with our conference, and our next speaker is Maria Domańska, whom I haven't met before, but I found you when I listened to another Zoom conference talking about a sort of analytical approach, why Russia and why Putin is doing what the state and what this person are doing at the moment. I think it's very important to understand this type of behavior of strongmen and political parties in general when we talk about illiberalism, populism, nativism, hegemonic behavior by a bigger state like Russia. To understand it, but not to accept it. I think there is a difference how to approach this problem. Both in Hungarian and in German, we say verstehen, to understand. But to understand might mean you accept it and you then become a follower, or you understand it but still disagree. And I think that's important to analyze Putin and his behavior from the second perspective. Maybe, I'm not sure whether we agree, but you will tell us your position. So Maria, the floor is yours, and you are welcome, more than welcome. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for having me here. I particularly like my topic because actually the fight for the future of liberal democracy is now taking place in Ukraine. So I'm going to focus also on Ukraine, and I'm afraid I'm going to repeat some of Jamie's points, but maybe in some aspects I will seem even more radical in some issues. The war in Ukraine is just one aspect of Russia's systemic conflict with the West, and they have been talking about the West as the enemy for many years now, and they explicitly expressed their position in the December ultimatum. And this conflict is not about any specific negotiable issues. It's viewed by Moscow as a fundamental geopolitical and civilizational conflict, because liberal democracy is considered to be an existential threat to the Russian ruling regime. In 2014 and again in 2022, we in fact saw the Brezhnev doctrine reactivated by Moscow. This is the idea of forward defense against a hostile liberal democratic ideology. And the narrative that Russia feels threatened by NATO in military terms has been a fake from the very beginning, actually. So Moscow treats this rivalry with NATO as a zero-sum game. So no middle ground is possible here to reach compromise. And our traditional win-win paradigm that I really admire is totally not applicable here. Russia's ultimate strategic goal vis-a-vis NATO and the EU is to dismantle these organizations, and we need to understand this. And they want to deal with individual states that would become automatically less resilient to Russian political leverage. It may seem utopian now against the backdrop of all the sanctions, but tough sanctions and the unprecedented mobilization of the Euro-Atlantic community don't mean that Russia will abandon this strategy anytime soon. And Russia's leadership have proved their readiness to commit mass killings to achieve their goals. And in the light of these goals, the conviction that still seems to prevail in some countries that they would never fall victim to Russia's aggressive actions is a serious misconception. By sowing instability abroad, the Kremlin is trying to prevent instability at home. And foreign policy is supposed to insulate the authoritarian regime from all kinds of real or imagined threats and challenges. So the Kremlin is ready to turn Ukraine into a huge black hole at our borders. But his strategic goal, Putin's strategic goal is to delegitimize the very idea of the European security based on NATO and the European Union. What has limited our capacity to deter Russia in recent years is a different strategic culture, differences among our strategic cultures, and also different understanding of security as such. Russia's invasion against Ukraine laid bare all Europe's mistakes and miscalculations made over the last decade. Many years of appeasing the increasingly aggressive Kremlin with offers of dialogue and avoiding to provoke Russia, just to quote usual catchphrase, toothless sanctions and continued economic financial cooperation, all of that shaped Moscow's perception of the European Union and the West as such, as deeply disunited, weak, corrupt, and unable to invest in its own security. So this is how they perceived us. And a large part of the Western establishment was eager to understand Moscow's great power ambitions, which were disguised as security concerns. As late as in early February this year, Emmanuel Macron still repeated that the European security architecture should be shaped together with and not against Russia. And the worst thing about it is that we felt quite comfortable making all these mistakes because we understood, we the West, not we the Central Europe, that it is not us who would pay the price for our mistakes and our short-sightedness. Because Russia has sort of convinced us that peace and stability for the EU and NATO can be bought at the expense of the third party's sovereignty. Now we know that it can't. And now Ukraine is paying the price for our mistakes. But I'm pretty sure that we are going to pay this price too, sooner or later, because as I've said, Ukraine is not Russia's ultimate goal. So my final, well, all in all, it was not only Russia that was dismantling the liberal democratic order, it was us. And we believed, another mistake, we believed we could save our values without investing in our hard security in a highly turbulent world. There were also many flaws, mistakes in our strategic communication because we kept sending wrong messages. We weren't able to shape the Kremlin's perception of the NATO and EU in line with our interests. Another, my eternal question is, in this context, what were and still are our interests? Because we didn't have any common strategy in the past. And I also can't see any common strategy now because, okay, we are doing lots of things now to support Ukraine and contain Russia, but roughly and in principle, all what we are doing now is mainly tactical and reactive. Just a couple of words about what you asked about. I mean, the main features of Russia's strategic culture. So my thesis for many years now is that the political and strategic culture of the Kremlin's decision makers is a mix of the Czechist, KGB, and mafia style mentality. They think in terms of a permanent special operation. Also, the language they use is just one of their active measures. It serves to manipulate and deceive and to signal intentions that are contrary to real ones. There is also their high readiness to take risks. And for them, foreign policy is just a fight without formal rules, where all kinds of dirty tricks are allowed. It is extremely difficult to deal with such opponent, of course, but it's not impossible to deal with Russia. We are now dealing with war criminals, and we should treat them adequately. Russia's understanding of security is also overwhelming because everything in Russia is securitized. There are no neutral spheres or topics. So we simply can't convince them in any way that we don't pose a threat to them. And I think that although the war in Ukraine is far from over, unfortunately, it's not too early to discuss our future security strategy. As this is a systemic conflict, the deep crisis will continue. And I like very much how Fiona Hill has put it. She said that we are not now on the brink of anything new. We have been well and truly in it for quite a long time, at least since 2014. We have been living a war that we didn't notice accidentally. Russia is trying to reassure itself now that the collective West, as they call us, cannot resist crude blackmail for a longer time. And that collective West will sooner or later get split and banned and if confronted with long enough psychological warfare. So Russia will keep testing who's going to blink first. So if we blink now, we will lose this war without even fighting it. What we should do first, and I'm going to repeat the previous points, the economic decoupling. I mean, the fullest possible economic blockade until Russia withdraws the last soldier from the Ukrainian territory. It may last for decades, of course. Okay, let it last for decades. So no interim measures, no softening of sanctions just because of some kind of truce or even a peace agreement, let's call it like that. We shouldn't make any long-term concessions in exchange for short-term pseudo concessions that Russia could revoke at any moment. We need to prepare for contingencies as soon as possible. How will we react if Russia attacks military transport for Ukraine on the NATO territory, or if it uses chemical weapons in Ukraine. Shall we wait until they do it? I think Russia must understand as soon as possible that it simply cannot afford further escalation. And also Ukraine cannot wait for months until the sanctions will ultimately ruin Russia's economy and force the Kremlin to make concessions. I'm pretty sure that we need full-fledged military support for Ukraine, including planes. I'm not buying this talk about offensive and defensive weapons. In Ukraine's situation, everything is defensive now. And the weapon deliveries made so far, for me, seem to fulfill wrong goals, because our goal should not be to make Russia spin its wheels in Ukraine. Our goal should be to free Ukraine from Russian occupation and rebuild the country as soon as possible. This is happening just too close to our borders. So I think that we should seize the agenda and make Russia react to our steps and not, continue to react to Russian steps all the time. And we should do whatever we can to make further aggressive reactions or actions by Russia just non-affordable for them. And this would be a kind of our forward defense as a response to their ideological forward defense. Ukraine is fighting now for our own security, and we absolutely cannot allow the Ukrainian resistance to collapse. We cannot just stay aside idly and wait and watch a big European state in the very center of Europe becoming a failed state for years or disappear from the map. We have already millions of refugees fleeing to Europe. And this is also an element of Russia's strategy to destabilize the whole continent, destabilize the European Union. The current 3 or more than 3 million is just a foretaste. And putting it quite bluntly, Russia doesn't need people in Ukraine. Russia needs territory. They need territory even if it is a no man's land. This is just for them a peculiar geopolitical asset. There is also a strong aspect, the global dimension of the whole issue, because if Ukraine disappears, or if Ukraine gets fragmented, or if it becomes a failed state, it will dramatically weaken the West's position also vis-a-vis China. Another question that arises is the very nature of Russian ruling regime. Because authoritarian Russia will always pose an existential threat to the West. And the whole top Russian elite have committed war crimes. So I'm pretty convinced that any economic or political cooperation that is not essential for us, really essential, should be developed in the future only with a new Russian leadership, the one committed to political reforms. Of course, the unprecedented unity of the EU and NATO vis-a-vis Russian invasion caught Moscow totally off guard. But now the question is how resilient this unity will be in the future. We need to understand that any kind of peaceful coexistence with Putin's Russia is over. And we can't feel safe anymore. Russia will be waging a war against NATO as long as the current regime, and precisely the regime and not only Putin, remains in power. There is also no division anymore into hard and soft security. We must convincingly demonstrate our readiness to defend our values with all possible means, including military ones. And also ordinary European citizens and European companies need to understand that the security of Ukraine, the independence of Ukraine, their sovereignty, territorial integrity, is the security for our own homes, because this is exactly what is at stake now. It's about how the international relations will develop on the European continent. And it may sound paradoxically, but possibly the only way to avoid a full-scale military conflict as to demonstrate our readiness to engage into it if needed, because only this can deter Russia. There is no other language the Kremlin is going to understand. We should change their perception of the Western world, and I believe that perception is a powerful instrument of foreign policy. And of course, last but not least, a $1 billion question is, suppose that some kind of truce or even a peace agreement is concluded. How are we going to force Russia to respect it now and in the coming years? How will we force Russia to roll back their troops from Ukrainian territory? I'm leaving this for further discussion. But one thing I'm pretty sure about is that the post-war EU-NATO security architecture will require serious enforcement and a broader engagement of the non-member states that are committed to democratic principles. The West must not only become capable of responding to emerging threats, but also effectively preventing them. And Ukraine is an inseparable part of our security space. European must stop meaning just European Union. European is a much broader term and much broader notion. I think that Ukraine should be immediately offered a candidate status for NATO and the European Union, because they have already proved that their army has become an asset for NATO. And I perfectly understand that in the case of the EU, it's going to be much more complicated because the membership would require complex institutional reforms. But the best moment to launch this reform process is just after the war. Hopefully it ends someday. And it should be as quick as possible with as comprehensive foreign assistance as possible. It may be some kind of official membership with some exceptions and interim periods, but membership would be a very strong political signal. It would be a strong signal not only towards Russia, but also towards the rest of the world that war as a tool of foreign policy is totally counterproductive in achieving a state's political goals. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria. That doesn't make us happier what you were talking about, but that's probably the analytical outcome, which is more important than our happiness, but we have to face reality. And you talked a lot what we should do actually. So it's very clear what you think, that the West probably has misunderstood, or especially some political players and analysts, about Putin and Putin's regime. And now it has become clear for almost everyone what's going on in Russia and what are the consequences of Putin's behavior, at least since 2014, but now especially because of his war against Ukraine. On the other hand, I still have a question whether we can influence somehow what would happen inside Russia, because in the long run, maybe we should speculate at least what can be changed, since we already have witnessed internal changes in our cases during the communist period, that regimes have changed, or regimes collapsed, or counter elites have stood up and took power in a way, and democracy has started to flourish, and so on and so on. So what do you think about this, including other scenarios about internal riots, palace revolution, and so on? So I still try to put some pressure on you to make us more optimistic that that will be not the end of history, that Putin will stay with us for forever. So what do you think? What can we do for an internal domestic change in Russia?
Well, I think we have two tools to influence it in a longer term, because there won't be any immediate effects. First tool is to keep the sanctions regime, I mean the full-fledged sanctions regime, for as long as needed. And it will be politically quite easy for us, because I don't expect Russia to withdraw from Ukraine, even after concluding some kind of a peace agreement. And I totally agree with Jamie that once Russian troops pop up somewhere, they will probably never gone until forced to, I mean, really forced to. But the full-fledged sanctions regime will incredibly increase the costs for this dictatorship that we are witnessing now, in managing the domestic politics, and also I'm pretty sure that a full-fledged sanctions regime will reduce their ability to sow chaos and instability abroad after a couple of months, because according to some initial forecasts by Russian economists, Russia will start to feel, I mean, really feel the very negative effects of sanctions only in a couple of months. So it's not an issue of weeks. But the second, and then we can just wait until there will be probably some split within the ruling elite, because I don't expect any revolution in Russia. Russian society is intimidated, and quite effectively intimidated by the authorities, by growing repressions that took place over the last 2 years, let's say. And also Russians have immense capacity of passive adaptation to worsening living standards. But I could expect some kind of split within the elite, some kind of a coup d'etat, we can call it like that. But it will need some time and really harsh economic crisis. Another thing we can do already, I mean, starting today, is to offer full support for the representatives of Russian civil society who emigrate and settle down in the European Union or in the West in general. These people are fleeing Russia because of stepping up repression, because this dictatorship is already evolving and very fast towards a totalitarian regime. And I'm pretty sure that all of us listened to yesterday's Putin speech. And when he started to talk about domestic politics and traitors and fifth column, it really had a Stalinist tone, I would say. And this is something really bad. And I think that the repression in Russia, political repression, will grow very fast and on an unprecedented scale. So we should save as many Russians as possible now, and save all those civil society structures that are now being destroyed by Russian authorities. Because if there is some regime change or leadership change, a very narrow window of opportunity will open. And then at that moment, these people can come back to Russia and try to build something better than the authoritarian regime again. And they can try to build a new Russia, a Russia that would be, let's say, more user-friendly or friendly towards the rest of the world. So I think we need to help them. We cannot now influence the situation within Russia for many reasons, also because of the growing information blockade that we've been witnessing over the last 3 weeks. So this is roughly what we can do to try to influence the domestic developments in Russia, but only in a longer term, and it would need many efforts and a very cohesive strategy on the part of the West.
All right, we have time only for one short question. If anyone would like to raise his or her hand. If not, I have a very short fast question for you. Namely, there is a general fear in the air in Europe, I think, and maybe in the United States too by now. What if Russia and China start to cooperate and create a totally new balance of power at the global level? What do you think? Is it possible, potentially? We see such steps recently, but maybe these were not very, very convincing. Although there was a meeting between Putin and the Chinese Communist leader at the Beijing Olympics. But how China reacted today shows that maybe it has some limits. So what do you think? Is this a provisoric misunderstanding between the two authoritarian regimes, or is this worst case scenario possible, that the two will meet each other and try to counterbalance the West, what we talked about, that the West is not in such a bad shape actually? So what do you think? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Russia's dream that China will help them to bypass sanctions and to save their economy under the Western sanctions regime. But I'm pretty sure that China is not going to die for Russia. I mean, they will try to draw as many benefits from the current situation. For example, they can try to buy out Russia on this big sale, because Russia's assets have lost like the majority of their value recently. But I think this is maybe mostly about some technical questions, because the sanctions regime is quite well tailored to hit Russia. The question is, are we going to tailor it or interpret it in a way that prevents China from helping Russia? So it's mostly about our strategy here and our dialogue with China, because China seems to be to adopt this wait and see position now, and they will do everything they can to earn as much money and earn as much political clout as possible. But I think that we can limit their possibilities to do it and prevent them, at least partially, from getting too much engaged in this whole geopolitical game.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Maria, for your contribution and your reactions to the questions. And please stay with us. It was our pleasure. And we might have some more questions at the end. But the next speaker, actually, from a very maybe similar or familiar perspective, an old friend of mine, Imants, Lieģis, who was also ambassador to Hungary. So we met here in Budapest a couple of years ago. He's going to speak about, maybe in a broader sense, about the future of liberal democracy, dealing with assaults on democracy within the dynamics of relations between the EU, USA, Russia, and China. At least that's the title of your presentation you gave to your presentation at the end. So thank you for joining us, Imants, and the floor is yours. If you have 15 minutes, please go ahead, and then we will have time for questions and remarks. Thank you for coming.
Okay, thanks very much, István. It's a pleasure to be linking in with you and being, albeit virtually, back in Hungary. I very much enjoyed my stint as Latvia's ambassador in Budapest those years ago. Now, you're right, Maria has just given us a very good insight into how the dictator at the helm of Russia's leadership has assaulted democracy and the post-Cold War order. And as you mentioned, I'm going to try and perhaps not focus so much on Russia, but try and widen the debate a little bit, because there have been other numerous assaults on democracy over the preceding years, and they've come from various tyrants using a system of terror management to sow fear and doubt in societies. And this is a quote from Timothy Schneider. So I want to place my overview basically within the context of, first of all, EU-US relations, then EU-US-China relations, and then finally a bit on China-Russia. So let me first look at the transatlantic dynamics that are taking place. And by the way, I will finish off with some modest proposals about how to deal with these attacks on democracy. So starting with the transatlantic dynamics, in normal circumstances, of course, the European Union and the United States are natural strategic allies whose partnerships really strengthen the rule-based international order and promotes shared values. But of course, the partnership does need to be nurtured, and not too long ago, we saw that when America sneezes, Europe catches a cold. From 2017 until 2021, the elected US president imperiled democracy in the country regarded by many as the bastion of freedom. And the culmination of this was, of course, the blatant physical assault on the symbol of democracy, the US Congress, on the 6th of January last year. And the repercussions of this are still being felt today within the United States and beyond. And of course, Jonathan already referred to this. So like many of the countries in our region, I think that the Trump years threatened to destabilize the security and peace dividend that our renewed democracies had fought so hard to achieve with our membership in both NATO and the European Union. As we know, NATO was announced as being obsolete by President Trump, but paradoxically, US financial support for our defense actually increased during the Trump era. Trump placed, of course, more faith in Putin than his own US intelligence services, and he placed more faith in Putin than many other democratically elected Western leaders. But as we know, for now, America has bounced back. Not only have we had the recent Summit for Democracy, which Jonathan talked about, but by December of last year, so this is really towards the end of the first year of Biden's presidency, the State Department was essentially saying that on practically every issue that they work on, and in practically every region of the world, they're working very closely with the European Union. So this consolidation of relations has, of course, now been greatly helped also by President Putin. There's been an incredible show of unity both within NATO and between the United States and Europe. The extent of US consultation and cooperation with European partners has been outstanding. But it's the political polarization within the United States itself that will once again challenge US relations with Europe and elsewhere in the next presidential election cycle. Polarization has affected US foreign policy and its global standing. Midterm elections later this year will no doubt be a reminder of what may lie ahead. Now, the other side of the coin relates to assaults on democracy within the European Union itself. The OSCE already back in 2014 assessed Hungary's parliamentary elections as free but not fair. Both Hungary and Poland failed in their attempts at the European Court of Justice to stop the EU from tying the payment of funds to democratic standards. But I also want to note the dynamics that were taking place just 5 years ago when I was ambassador in Paris. We had the shock of Brexit, the referendum, we had the election of Trump, and this was leading, 5 years ago to very dire predictions about Frexit, the prospect of Marine Le Pen becoming the president of France, and the demise of the European Union. But in spite of interference by Russia in Macron's election campaign, he did manage to put a halt to this populist wave by defeating Le Pen in the second round of the elections. Fortunately, many of the populist groupings, both left and right, that have received direct financial support from Russia during the last 5 years have now been given an enormous blow to their anti-democratic credentials by Putin's war against Ukraine. So what about this EU-US dynamic with China? Secretary Blinken has indicated that the US relationship with China will be the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. And he called for engagement with China from a position of strength. We can compare that with what President Macron said, that it would be counterproductive to join together against China. But once again, perhaps recent events may well push America and the EU closer on their China policy, given China's bonding more closely with Russia against the common enemy. So although China scorns liberal values, human rights and democracy, the EU, of course, has referred to China as a partner for cooperation, an economic competitor, and a systematic rival. We've had a new EU-US dialogue on China, which has resulted in cooperating with China where possible. And even though the EU-US assessments on China may be similar, policy responses to China's growing international assertiveness may well differ. As we know, the European Union in a few weeks' time on the 1st of April is going to have a virtual summit with China. And it's interesting from the Latvian perspective to see what's happening with Lithuania, because they've, of course, placed a spoke in the wheel of relations, EU relations with China, and China's efforts to divide and rule European countries with its 17+1 arrangements to promote the Belt and Road policy came unstuck last year when various Europeans downgraded their level of participation at that summit with President Xi Jinping. Lithuania, as we know, subsequently left the 17+1 format. In addition, Lithuania allowed, Taiwan to open a diplomatic office in Vilnius using the word Taiwan instead of the acceptable Taipei. China's reaction, which has been described as being an overreaction, was very harsh. Imports from Lithuania to China were banned, diplomats were thrown out, they no longer have ambassadors in either of their capitals. And then even companies from across Europe whose exports to China merely contained Lithuanian components were also targeted for bureaucratic harassment by China. This meant that the EU Commission launched a claim against China at the WTO in January this year for discriminatory trade practices. But even before the EU put its support behind Lithuania, America already in September last year praised the approach taken by Vilnius to stand up against tyranny. In his phone call with Lithuania's Prime Minister Simonite, the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan expressed US appreciation for Lithuania's principled foreign policy in support of democracy and human rights. So in many ways, it's interesting how Lithuania has been exemplary in facing up to the assaults on democracy which have emanated from China. I now want to move on to the Russia-China dynamic. We've seen over the last years that Chinese-Russian cooperation has meant joint military exercises, including a large-scale naval drill, Joint Sea 2021, in October last year. Also last year, after the Russian and Chinese foreign ministers met in March, a year ago, we then had, firstly, the first massive increase of Russian troops by the Ukrainian border. And we also had, after that, a highly publicized Chinese amphibious assault exercises and the highest frequency of air incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone in nearly 25 years. So it's clear that China is watching very closely the US-led reaction to Russia's war in Ukraine. China will no doubt note the US intelligence penetration and its disclosures. China will be noting the mistakes made by Putin. And finally, China will see a very united US and European reaction, which involves speedy and drastic sanctions being imposed. At the same time, China has not given Russia unequivocal support in responding to the war. There have been abstentions in the voting at the UN and a move to stop loans to Russia by the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. This week, we also saw US warnings to China about providing military and economic help in Russia's war against Ukraine. President Putin's and Xi Jinping's meeting at the Winter Olympics, which you referred to, István, just weeks before Putin's full-scale assault on Ukraine, was one of almost nearly 40 previous bilateral meetings between the two presidents. And this time it resulted, of course, in a joint statement which rejected NATO expansion in Europe and US moves in Asia. It referred to the promotion of democracy as a Western plot. So here we see that the common interests by these two authoritarian powers unite against our accepted values. And I fully agree with what Maria said when she said that China is not going to die for Russia. I thought that was a very good comment. So how can we deal with these assaults on democracy that I've described? I've got some specific suggestions and some general ones. Obviously, I very much support what Jamie Shea said about the need to spend more on defense. That goes without saying. I think that we need to, what is very important, maintain a strong transatlantic unity. As I mentioned, Europe is America's natural strategic ally. We have shared values about freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And these should continue to be upheld by strategic partners so as to promote these values on a global scale. We need to avoid a return to the sphere of influence approach. And this again, István, is something you mentioned at the opening of our conference. The Helsinki approach of 1975, embedded in the establishment of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, this approach does need to prevail. where individual states have the right to determine their own fates. They should not be used as pawns in a chessboard amongst larger powers, some led by tyrants, as indeed happened in Yalta in 1945. Next, the European Union needs to deal with China on the level of 27+1, thereby abandoning the 17+1 format, which encourages splits in a united approach. I think it's also important that larger member states, such as France and Germany, should not cajole their smaller partners, as we saw happened really in December 2020, when the German EU presidency concluded with a push to force an agreement on the investment agreement with China. The Commission, as in the case of Lithuania, should continue to be vigilant in defending member states being coerced by China. And I think that it's important that the West needs to exploit the differences between China and Russia, given that China, and let's not forget that China's economy is now 10 times larger than Russia's. China, therefore, has more of an interest in stability in contrast to Russia's disruptive tendencies. And then on some general concepts, I think that we need to maintain calm and resilience, and Jamie referred to the resilience issue, in the face of assaults by outside tyrants. The Ukrainians are a fantastic example to the whole world in facing up at great cost to Putin's war. Tyrants acting within a country, that's not having an external assault on them. So tyrants acting within a country also need to be challenged at an early stage by avoiding the disappearance of checks and balances, the dissolution of political parties, the suspension of freedom of expression, or of the right to fair trial. The other thing is that perhaps we need to learn from our peers in other countries. As we know, Russia employed the same techniques against Ukraine in 2014 as it did against the United States and elsewhere, making it crucial to deal quickly with fake news and cyber warfare. Just as the assaults on democracy are often transnational or coordinated amongst peers, so resistance against such assaults should be developed in close cooperation with other victims. And finally, I think it's important to retain the general principle of speaking truth to power. This is a duty that all Democrats must employ, even at the risk of personal, even if it means taking personal risks. Fact-based truths should never be swept under the carpet, and psychopaths should be given short shrift and challenged if their assumptions are ill-founded or dubious. So on that note, István, I will conclude and happy to engage with questions.
Well, thanks a lot, Imants. That was again a broad picture on international relations and all the threats we face and the different relationships between international actors and how we should analyze it and what to do next. It's such a complex picture. It's hard for me to raise a new question because we discussed many aspects of these issues before, but maybe what might be interesting for us being here in Central Europe, and we already discussed a lot about Russia, Ukraine, and a little bit China. But one issue what was always in our mind to be discussed, that's the future of the transatlantic relations, especially since for many years the United States has somehow moved away from its European partners, especially during the Trump era, what you also referred to. And because China became such an important player and economic giant, and now because of the Russian threat. But the core of our safety and security was NATO and the transatlantic relationship. So how would you evaporate that very issue, the core of our security for the future?
Yeah, well, I think you're right to focus on that, because as I mentioned in one of my suggestions is that the transatlantic link is really crucial for maintaining peace and security and stability in the European continent. And I mean, if I was like analyzing the situation even in October of last year, before we had the offer that was put out by Putin to NATO and the United States, as an excuse for really starting this enhanced war against Ukraine. I mean, if I go back to what I was thinking in October last year, I was thinking more of the risk of the United States, as you mentioned, István, being slightly detached from Europe, and focusing, as it had declared, on the Indo-Pacific region. We had seen during the course of last year the disaster of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We saw this, the mishandling of the way in which the United States dealt with the AUKUS incident, the submarines, and their going behind the back of France vis-a-vis, their agreement with Australia, which itself was an indication of their concerns about Chinese assertiveness in the region. So if I look back at October last year, those were my major concerns, and I was saying, well, Latvia needs to make sure that we don't create problems for the United States, that we try to ensure that their focus remains on in Europe. Well, if we look at the situation today, it's actually, Putin has helped us to achieve that. That's the irony, because we've got a massive engagement of the United States in Europe. We've got an extraordinary summit taking place next week of the heads of state of government. President Biden will be once again visiting Europe. We saw in the lead up to the war the incredible cooperation and consultation that Washington was having with its partners in Europe, whether it's also the UK, EU member states. Okay, the EU was very much sidelined in this whole thing, but has certainly, thanks to Germany's role, now become extremely engaged in the defense and security of Europe, being led by Germany's 180 degrees turnaround on its defense and security policy. So I mean, I think that's the, Ukraine is paying the human price for us, but, it has meant that today, the United States and the transatlantic link, I think, has never been as strong as it ever has. Jamie Shea did say that, of course, the threat of terrorism to the south, the Sahel region, Sub-Sahara, those threats are still out there. And it's right that also in Latvia, there is an acceptance that the security of Europe is something that is 360 degrees. We're very satisfied that there is the focus now on collective defense, and the increase, as we have been hearing in the defense ministers, NATO defense ministers meeting these days, that we'll hope to have a permanent presence of allied troops to deter future Russian actions. So to that extent, I'm very positive about the outcome of the unfortunate events that are happening, on our doorstep in Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, I think that collective security, that's a key argument, and especially from your perspective, including your geographic situation as Wojciech Przybylski mentioned it in the morning, this North European perspective, and it's not only by chance that most Polish and Baltic analysts have views like yours regarding transatlantic relationship and the risks coming from our global environment. We will have one more question. Please, Helena, make it very short because your term is coming, your session is coming in 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you for your...
I'm learning so much. I'm learning so much. So thank you very much. I just wanted to ask, in the newspapers here recently in America, we're reading that Russian forces are stretched, overstretched, and maybe running out, frankly. And is this true? Yeah. That's my basic question. Do you think that there's a possibility that they actually run out of ammunition and troops, and that, yeah?
Yeah, I think, which is something, of course, in our favor because it reduces their capacity. But if they're asking for recruits to be brought in from Armenia, from Syria, I think that these indications are really an illustration of the fact that they are having problems with their troops, and not to mention the problems that they've had on the ground with supplies during the assaults, and the anticipation that they would take Kiev in 2 days. So clearly, I think the myth about Russia's military might has really been exploded and exposed as being another bluff element of the usual Russian tactic that we're very used to.
Yeah, I think the blitzkrieg is over, so we might think about new scenarios, and we don't know what was discussed before, what a sort of peace talk and peace agreement might mean for Ukraine and for Europe and for the United States as well. I think we cannot finish this topic at all right now, but we have to finish our session. Thank you very much, Imants. Actually, all your partners had to leave, so this session was a little bit abruptly over, but thanks for being with us. And if you still have time, please join us, because the last session will be also very exciting with different issues, with different presenters and a different moderator, because Eric Uszkiewicz, vice chairperson of our Hungarian Europe Society, will moderate the last session. So you will